think that we are still part of the tussle to some extent, but Iran has the upper hand. And I think the Saudis have somewhat, given up on playing a role in this arena. They don't have allies they can utilize anymore. Their checkbook diplomacy did not pay dividends the way that they hoped it would. They're not very strategic.
Yeah.
They're not very, they don't do diplomacy very well, I think. Or they haven't in the last few decades in Lebanon. They invested a lot in specific people.
Yeah.
And then they get impatient when those people don't deliver. And when one of them gets killed, like Rafiq Hariri, there isn't really an obvious replacement. I mean, yes, then you hand over to the son. But if the son doesn't deliver, then you're left with not much capacity. Right? They don't build alliances and networks and state-to-state relations in an organization to organization and ministry to ministry. They're not systematic in the way they do this. So at the end of the day, they find themselves outmaneuvered by a country that is under sanctions, that has a much smaller budget, a bigger army, but can't deploy it in the region. So it deploys its proxy militias and its paramilitary, revolutionary guards and its Quds force, etc. And they're very good at that, the Iranians. They're very, very good at centralizing decision-making and fanning out and using their proxies in the region. And they are very good at building loyalty through patronage, fear, and cash.
Yeah.
And and weaponry, obviously.
Yes.
The fear factor is there as well. I mean, they pay and they provide, but there's also fear involved. And that buys you some of the forced loyalty. But at the moment, it looks to me as though Iran has the upper hand here. And I'm not quite sure I see how the Saudis can recuperate that, if they even want to, because they sort of felt that it was, a sunken cost and they should just give it up.
Right.
I want to go back to to address the second point of your question. What we're seeing in Lebanon with the protest movement is to some extent separate from the regional struggle, because it is about our national identity and our future, independently of those two, right? Independently of what Saudi Arabia and Iran have to offer. Except that because of Iran's entrenched role in Lebanon through a group like Hezbollah, it ends up being a lot about Iran's role in Lebanon de facto.
Right.
It ends up being a lot about Hezbollah's involvement in the corruption and its veto power and its, rejection of reforms, etc., etc., and its presence in Lebanon as a deterrent to foreign investment and to, tourism, etc., etc. So it feeds into what people are protesting about. But it did not start out as a protest movement against Hezbollah or against Iran.
Right.
It is part of the subtext.
Right.
But I want to address something you said. I want to address the issue of modernity, because I want our listeners, your listeners and viewers to understand that 1979 was not necessarily, or should not be only put in the context of a rejection of modernity, because I don't want people to come away thinking that this region is not compatible with modernity.
Of course.
I think we have to be very careful. Neither is Islam.
Yes.
And that is one of the big misconceptions. I think it's more about forced modernization following a specific model too rapidly, to sort of try to impose a template where you will have Western music, you will wear miniskirts, and you will study French history. When people think, well, actually, I'm quite happy with my modest hijab, and I can still learn about French history, but actually I would also like to read about Ibn Battuta or whatever. Right? So I think we need to be careful to frame this properly.
Sure.
I think that yes, there's a whole episode that could be done about the drivers of the Iranian Revolution, and some of it was a rejection of the Shah's, white revolution, this forced, rapid modernization, capitalism, etc., the Western model. And then came Khomeini, who took that and turned a revolution against a despot, a king, and a revolution against Western imperialism.
Yes.
Driven mostly by leftists, modernists, nationalists, and turned it into an Islamic revolution. And the ripple effect went beyond Iran. And that's why we saw this trend over 40 years that pushed back against some of the opening up and the progressive lifestyle that was starting to become part of the region.
Yes.
And it rippled out of Iran, and then the reaction in Saudi Arabia, etc., all the way to Pakistan and Egypt and so on. But my mother grew up in the Netherlands. She's Dutch, and she grew up in what was in the 50s and 60s, or in the 50s still, a very conservative, somewhat puritanical society.
Right.
We have to remember that today's Netherlands was not the Netherlands of the 50s. There was a progression there.
Yes.
But it happened on a different timeline.
Yeah.
And there were things that are acceptable in the Netherlands today that were not acceptable, that were frowned upon. And to some extent, when my mother came to Lebanon in the 60s, she found a country that was much freer, and there were parties, and there was going out, and she loved it, and that's why she stayed. And it's this terrible turn that we took in 1979 with the start of the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia that brought us to where we are today.